Summer was coming to an end, and the HR department at work finally decided to grant me my well-deserved vacation. As a 35-year-old single and financially stable man, I decided to spend a month away from work, heading to my father's village to indulge in one of my favorite activities, fishing. Dad had been inviting me over for a long time. Since my mother passed away 2 years ago, it has been tough for him there, lonely, but he doesn't want to leave, even though I have suggested it more than once. I packed my things, loaded everything into the car's trunk, and by 9 a.m., I was speeding down the highway toward my hometown. I must say that the drive took almost the entire day, so I always arrived around 8 in the evening. The village itself consisted of 50 houses, which, by the standards of that region, was considered quite a large settlement. I spent my entire childhood happily in this place, so my memories of it were the warmest. Approaching the turn to the village, I almost missed it because the sign was covered in black paint. The local hooligans must have done it. Every time I came to the village, it always welcomed me with joyful chatter on the streets and a huge crowd of local kids who looked at the expensive car with amazement. However, this time it was different. The streets were half empty. The children mostly walked with their parents, and the village was surprisingly quiet, as if everyone had disappeared at once. Amazed by this turn of events, I drove the car to my father's house. On the surface, everything was the same. Even the shed my father built for me as a hideaway for my games was still there. I pushed the gate, which my father had never locked in my memory because everyone in the village was known, and there were no strangers in or near the village, but the gate was locked. Strange, I thought, but there was nothing else to do. I had to knock on the gate with my foot, like in the old days. There was some noise in the house, followed by a question. "Who's there?" "Dad, it's me." "Oh, Andre, you finally decided to come." Shuffling steps sounded somewhere in the yard. The gate swung open, and there stood my father. It seemed that the years went by, but he hadn't changed. Still the same sturdy and stocky man. That's what living on homegrown food and breathing fresh air does. We spent the entire evening at the table, talking about this and that, and tasting Dad's homemade moonshine. Closer to midnight, we both got drowsy and went to our rooms to sleep. In the morning, surprisingly, I didn't have a headache. That's what natural products do. After breakfast, I announced that I was going fishing, to which Dad just grinned and promised to join me later. Agreeing on the place where he would find me, I quickly dug up some worms, gathered my gear, and headed to the local lake. I had to walk through the entire village, but that's how I did it all my childhood, so nothing new there. It felt as if I had left just yesterday. More than 17 years had passed, but everything remained the same. However, as soon as the note of nostalgia faded, I once again noticed the silence and emptiness. No, not like in cheap horror movies, where there's no sound at all in the village. My village was definitely alive, with cows mooing here and there, dogs barking, and people chatting in the yards, but the streets were empty. There were no ubiquitous children, no grandmothers sitting on benches by the houses. Even when I reached the lake, I didn't see a single person relaxing there. No one was swimming, no one was running along the sandy shore, and there wasn't even a single fisherman. Indeed, while the village hadn't changed outwardly, the spirit of freedom and joy had definitely vanished, replaced by some sort of tension and anticipation, I thought. However, as soon as the first bite happened, all the bad thoughts were literally blown out of my head. An hour later, my dad arrived, and we started hauling in our catch together. We even began to compete to see who could catch more, just like in the old days. However, as soon as the midday sun became particularly hot, we decided to head home. When the euphoria from fishing had somewhat subsided, my father and I were just approaching the village. That's when I remembered what had surprised me the most since my arrival. "Dad, why are the streets so empty? There are hardly any children or adults." Dad immediately seemed to deflate, muttered something under his breath, and said, "Son, let's talk about it at home in the evening. It's not the right time now." "All right," I nodded, puzzled. The rest of the day was spent on household chores, and evening came unnoticed. No matter how much my father tried to avoid the conversation, I insisted. So, he had no choice but to curse, place a bottle of moonshine on the table, and begin his story. "You see, son, strange things started happening here about 5 years ago. It all began with a woman who lived on the edge of the village, remember? Evdokia. One night, she disappeared without a trace. We searched and searched for her, but found nothing. Not even a single clue. After her, a young boy disappeared, maybe about 15 years old. He went fishing in the evening and never came back. Everyone realized something was wrong around 11 o'clock. We ran to the lake. His fishing rods were there, half a bucket of fish, but no sign of the boy. We shouted, called, and searched, but we never found him. Since then, people in the village have started disappearing in the evenings. We pondered all sorts of things, from a serial killer to wild animals, but it turned out to be much scarier. One night, a local guy went out to the yard to smoke and saw something big crawling down the street slowly. He shone his flashlight there, expecting to find a wild animal, but instead he found an evil spirit. A tall, pale creature with long limbs was walking down the streets, tapping on the gates of houses where the lights were on. The man was almost scared to death. In the morning, when everyone in the village knew about the incident, we all went together to Granny Agafia. Remember the old woman who lived on the outskirts? She's like our local healer, knows a bit about all things mystical. Granny Agafia listened to us, shook her head, and sighed. "Based on the description, we've got a hobir roaming around. It's a big, undead creature, always thirsty for blood. It goes out hunting mostly at dusk, and by dawn it crawls back into its grave, dragging the victim's corpse with it. Granny also told us how to get rid of such a neighbor, but not everything. She said to come back in the morning. She'd look it up in her books overnight, find the dug-up grave, and tell us how to kill it in the morning. But when we came back in the morning, Granny wasn't there, and there were big footprints on the ground. Looks like her evil spirit took her away. Granny has been living alone for 2 years since her husband died." By the time my father finished his story, I was sitting there full of skepticism because it all sounded like complete nonsense. I don't know what came over me at that moment. Maybe curiosity, or maybe the alcohol I had been drinking, but I felt a sudden urge to go out for a walk at night. Not that I was looking for the undead or anyone else. I just wanted to debunk this village legend for myself. Father was already fast asleep, and I, stepping outside the gate, began to wander around the village at night. The moon was shining brightly, and I didn't need a flashlight. After staggering around for about half an hour, I still hadn't found a single so-called undead, and I happily headed home. As I approached the turn onto my street, I saw a silhouette ahead. Apparently, another enthusiast of nocturnal strolls, just like me, I thought. But as the silhouette got closer, it looked less and less like a person to me. I started to sober up a bit as the approaching figure looked terrifying. Because the streetlights in the village were spaced about 25 meters apart, the silhouette remained in the shadows, but I distinctly understood that it was definitely not human. It was too large, and it moved as if on all fours. The alcohol spell was completely broken when that thing came into the light. It stood about 20 meters away from me, but that was enough for me to discern its main features. It resembled what my father described, but it seemed like he had downplayed the description of this monstrosity. The creature was hunched over, its arms hanging limply to the ground, with thin, long fingers ending in sharp claws. The skin was covered with ulcers and necrotic patches, and it had a grayish-blue hue. As for its face or muzzle, I don't know what this creature had there. I couldn't see it because of the long hair hanging from its head. The only thing I managed to notice was its huge mouth, adorned with a large number of small, needle-like teeth. Of course, my first thought was that it was all a prank, but that thought literally evaporated when I caught a whiff of the stench emanating from this entity. It smelled like rotting flesh mixed with blood, damp earth, and burning skin. Such special effects wouldn't have been arranged just for me, obviously. Unfortunately, as it turned out, not only did I notice this evil spirit, but it noticed me as well. The creature abruptly stopped and sniffed the air. Then, in a somewhat comical, yet surprisingly fast manner, it charged towards me. I don't know why, but I didn't feel any wild terror at that moment. Adrenaline and a sense of danger drowned everything else out. I didn't have time to reach the house. The bastard was getting closer and closer, and I couldn't think of anything better than to run to the old cowsheds. It was narrow and cramped there, and I doubted this creature with its size could pursue me there. I successfully looped around the cowsheds for about 5 minutes until I stumbled over some cursed brick and fell headfirst into a concrete block. I woke up already on the street. My head was horribly hurting. My face was covered in blood, and my leg was throbbing terribly. Gradually, the ability to think and feel returned, and as I slightly opened my eyes, I almost lost consciousness again, but this time from fear. The creature was dragging me, holding onto my leg, somewhere towards the outskirts. A sharp flash of pain in my head made me black out again, apparently hitting some stone. There was absolutely no strength to resist. Finally, I came to my senses in the cellar of some house near a dug-up grave. Peering inside, I saw that same creature. Apparently, it was resting after its nightly hunt. To my relief, the hatch was open, and I silently made my way to freedom. The only source of light in the basement was a pipe that led outside for ventilation, but it seemed that I was not meant to escape without incident. Literally near the stairs, something crunched under my foot, and upon examining the source of the sound, I was horrified. It was a human bone. Upon closer inspection, I realized that the entire floor was littered with bones, and in the far corner lay the mummified body of some woman. I couldn't see anything more, and frankly, I didn't want to. However, it seemed that the owner of this house also heard the crunch of bones, and some rustling was heard from his grave. There was no time to hesitate. The creature was starting to emerge. I bolted up the stairs, but the creature turned out to be very agile. As soon as I moved away from the hatch, 2 long clawed paws appeared from there, starting to probe around the hatch. Then there was a ferocious roar, and without waiting for this horror to continue, I ran forward again. I was almost at the exit when the creature caught up with me and, knocking me to the ground, seized my hand, vigorously shaking its head from side to side, causing my hand to simply detach from my body. I screamed in wild pain. Thrashing in a fit of agony, by some miracle, I struck a door. The door swung open, and bright sunlight flooded into the room. The creature smoked, roared, and leaped away into the depths of the house. Exhausted from pain and terror, I crawled out of the house and strangely lost consciousness. I came to in the hospital, covered in bandages and stitches, with my father sitting next to me. I had never seen him cry before, but now, before me, stood not the sturdy and stocky man I had known all my life, but an elderly man who seemed to have aged 10 years overnight. Long rehabilitation, treatment, and a lifetime of disability. That was the price I paid for my skepticism. But the biggest trauma remained in my soul, for my world was turned upside down in an instant. All my life, I believed there were no monsters, and that all those were just silly stories told to tickle the nerves of particularly gullible fools. But now, I was personally involved in one of those horror stories. As my father recounted, he began to worry when he didn't find me at home in the morning and went looking for me, expecting me to be up to some mischief. He searched the entire village until he reached the outskirts, where he found me lying just 3 meters from the entrance to the house, bleeding out. They took me to the hospital, and upon searching the house and discovering that thing in the basement, they immediately brought in a tanker truck with gasoline. They buried the basement and sealed it up. The mummified body was identified as the owner of the house, the very same old lady, Agafia, and the coffin belonged to her late husband. Apparently, the old lady couldn't come to terms with her loss, attempted some sort of witchcraft, but failed miserably, and paid the price herself. She wanted the villagers to correct her mistake, but the monster was quicker. The house was doused in gasoline and set on fire, after which concrete slabs were laid over the entrance to the basement, thereby sealing away this abomination in its tomb forever.